Good morning. Today's hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China, the threat of transnational repression from China and the U.S. response will come to order. In recent years, this commission has devoted increased attention to the Chinese Communist Party and government's human rights violations in the United States and globally. We've expanded our reporting, brought in additional expertise, held a range of hearings on the toolkit employed for these abuses. That toolkit includes economic coercion, technology-enhanced authoritarianism, and other ways to stifle criticism, avoid accountability, and undermine international human rights norms. In this hearing, we will examine a part of that tool set that targets individuals and communities at a very personal level, transnational repression. In addition to the egregious human rights abuses they commit within Chinese borders, Chinese authorities increasingly reach into other countries to silence dissidents, conduct surveillance, and force the repatriation of critics. This long arm of authoritarianism across borders is not just a violation of human rights, it is a violation of countries' national sovereignty. These tactics, targeting Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, human rights advocates, journalists, and others, add up to what Freedom House calls the most sophisticated, global, and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression in the world. By Freedom House's conservative count, between 2014 and 2021, there were 214 cases of direct physical attack originating from China across dozens of countries, including right here in the United States of America. International manhunts like Operation Fox Hunt and Operation Skynet go well beyond supposed corruption suspects to include critics and others deemed sensitive. This leaves many Uyghurs and others in a precarious position, especially as other governments at times cooperate with the Chinese governments against the rights of migrants. We have also seen the Chinese government exploit international organizations toward these repressive ends. The abuse of INTERPOL mechanisms, such as red notices, can trigger detentions and even rendition of the targets of transnational repression. At the United Nations, authoritarian governments seek to erode norms of universal human rights, and Chinese pressure can deny representatives of civil society or diaspora communities the opportunity to access UN forums. Even when Chinese authorities don't reach their targets physically, they surveil and coerce them in other ways, such as by deploying spyware, threatening them in video calls, harassing their family members who still live in China. In response to these disturbing trends, the Biden administration has sought to elevate the issue of transnational repression both within the United States government and in interactions with countries around the globe, whether they be like-minded countries seeking to address this menace, or perpetrators of transnational repression, or countries on whose soil this behavior occurs. In today's hearing, we will hear from two administration officials at the forefront of these efforts. We wanted to hear from multiple parts of the U.S. government because addressing transnational repression will truly require a whole-of-government approach. To raise awareness globally and prevent these tactics from becoming pervasive in the international system, we need diplomacy. To protect those targeted, we need humanitarian and homeland responses. To pursue accountability for those responsible, we need law enforcement. The Department of State, Homeland Security, Justice, Treasury, Commerce, and others all have a role to play. This hearing will allow us to hear from two of those agencies on the steps the administration is taking to counter transnational repression from China, how they coordinate across the interagency with other governments and international organizations, and where we have the opportunity to do more. Certain aspects of the U.S. response will be most appropriate for members of the Commission to explore in a closed session. That is especially true for certain law enforcement matters, and we are working with the Department of Justice to arrange such an opportunity in the coming weeks. For today's hearing, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on what their departments are doing in coordination with partners in government, civil society, the private sector, the international community to address transnational repression from China. The scope and complexity of this threat requires not only a whole-of-government approach, but vigilance, coordination, and decisive action across the administration and Congress. I hope today's hearing helps us take a step in developing urgency around this issue and charting a path forward for addressing it. I now recognize, my pleasure to recognize, Congressman McGovern for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing about transnational repression by the People's Republic of China. You know, in September 2020, federal authorities arrested a New York City police officer and U.S. Army reservist for acting as an illegal agent of the Chinese government. The man, originally from Tibet, had tried to ingratiate himself within the Tibetan American community of New York. It turns out he was spying on them and advancing Chinese interests. This revelation caused fear and concern in the community. The Uyghur Americans at Radio Free Asia, who worked diligently to report facts from Xinjiang, including crimes against humanity, are protected by our First Amendment safeguard of freedom of the press. The Chinese government has attempted to silence them by punishing their relatives back home. Gulchera Hoja testified before this commission in 2018 that 24 of her relatives are missing, almost certainly held in re-education camps run by Chinese in Xinjiang. These are but two examples. The Chinese government tries to deflect criticism of its human rights record by claiming that it has a sovereign right to do what it wants within its borders. And yet, Chinese officials have no problem setting aside sovereignty principles when they reach across our border to threaten the human rights of Americans. In his May 26 speech on China, Secretary of State Tony Blinken said the Chinese government purports to champion sovereignty and territorial integrity while standing with governments that brazenly violate them. I would add that the Chinese government itself violates them. I am pleased that the Biden administration has recognized this trend and is deploying diplomatic, investigative, and prosecutorial resources to the problem. I look forward to hearing from Undersecretary Zaya and Assistant Secretary Hoy about what their respective departments are doing to address this issue and these violations. We want to hear whether there are additional authorities or tools that you need from Congress, including the expansion of humanitarian pathways to provide refuge to those who risk their lives to stand up to authoritarian regimes. We also look forward to getting input from the Department of Justice in a separate setting, as the Chair has already mentioned. While our focus today is China, my concern on this issue has been global. Freedom House's extensive report from earlier this month finds that 36 governments engage in transnational repression and documented 735 incidents of direct physical transnational repression between 2014 and 2021, with 85 incidents in 2021 alone. I, along with several of my colleagues, have expressed concern over transnational repression by Egypt, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, including such heinous crimes as the murder of U.S. resident and journalist Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi officials and the poisoning of Russians living in exile in the U.K. by Russian authorities. I hope to hear how the administration is approaching the challenge, not only as a whole-of-government effort, but as a global one, too. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very, very much, and now recognize Congressman Smith, who would like to make some opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this important hearing this morning. You know, last year on June 4th, to commemorate the 32nd anniversary of the horrific Tiananmen Square massacre, I attended the unveiling of a work of art at Liberty Sculpture Park in Yermo, California. There, the Chinese emigre sculptor Chen Weiming introduced an iconic work entitled CCP Virus, which morphed an image of Xi Jinping onto a coronavirus cell, and it was the size of a small house. That's how big the artwork was. A physical monument to the devastation unleashed by the Chinese Communist Party onto the world. Chinese agents, it should be noted, were there in attendance that day. A little over a month later, however, the sculpture had been burned to the ground in an arson attack, which at the time local media reports speculated was attributable to the Chinese Communist Party agents. Certainly, sculptor Chen and other emigres thought so, and the repression they thought they had left behind in China was catching up with them in the California desert. Then in March of this year, federal prosecutors unsealed charges against 5 men accused of taking orders from China's Ministry of State Security to, quote, stalk, harass, and spy on Chinese dissidents who had destroyed the sculpture. Among these were Frank Liu, a former corrections officer named Matthew Zebrius, and Jason's son, the latter who ordered the destruction of, quote, all sculptures that are not good to our leaders, close quote. As this incident suggests, today's hearing is so timely because China's long arm of repression is not something that occurs, quote, over there, but right here in the United States of America. And the cases of this are legion. Wei Jingsheng, the father of the democracy movement in China, who parenthetically I met in Beijing in the early 1990s when the CCP thought he was such a high-value political prisoner, let him out of prison, tried to convince the International Olympic Committee to award them Olympics 2000. When the OIC did not give them Olympics 2000, they rearrested Wei and tortured him almost to the point of death. In 1998, Wei testified at a hearing that I chaired and detailed the abuse he suffered and endured, again, all for democracy, and now he was free in the United States, thank God. Today, however, Wei believes that several assassination attempts have been made on his life, including a poisoning attempt that required nearly a month-long hospitalization and resulted in a 40-pound loss of weight. More recently, on May 20th, after dropping off a guest at Reagan National Airport, two cars sought to run the car Wei was riding off the road. I'd be happy to share with our witnesses, especially from Homeland Security, the police report number should they wish to follow up on this, and I certainly hope that they would. Another prominent dissident, Chinese dissident, who has faced harassment believed to be orchestrated by the CCP is Pastor Bob Fu, a longtime friend of this commission. One tactic the CCP uses is to plant fake dissidents among the community and use them to create division among the emigres. In Pastor Fu's case, his antagonist was Guo Wanggi, otherwise known as Miles Guok. Guo not only used media platforms that he owned to attack Pastor Fu, something all of us in public life need to endure, but certainly not to the degree that Bob Fu endured, but is alleged to have organized daily protests outside of his home. As the threats were made to his life, upon the advice of local and federal law enforcement, Pastor Fu and his family were evacuated from their home and forced to live in separate, distinct locations. Then there's the murder in March of this year of Zhijing Li, an organizer of the Tiananmen Square student movement, who spent 2 years in a Chinese prison following the massacre before fleeing and establishing himself as a lawyer, primarily serving the Chinese community in Flushing, New York. He was stabbed to death by a 25-year-old woman who arrived from China on a student visa, though she apparently never went to school and spent her time immersing herself in pro-democracy activities. While many of the media reports report the death as a straightforward murder, many in the dissident community believe it was a professional hit job by a Chinese agent given the, quote, professional nature of the stabbing. And I would commend you to an article by Radio Free Asia, which catalogs some of those concerns. Mr. Chairman, as you know, this is a crisis. We have prominent Chinese dissidents, including Wei Jingsheng, again, the father of the democracy of all movement, whose lives are in danger, living right here in the United States. And that goes as well for many of the Uyghurs. I know Rabia Kadir and others over the years have had problems with Chinese agents. And again, look what they're doing in China itself with the genocide. And of course, those who speak out here are at risk. We need to bring more attention to this. This hearing helps to do that. And I do thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Congressman Smith. And I'd now like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Uzra Zaya is the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights at the U.S. Department of State. She also serves as the U.S. Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues. She previously was the President and CEO of the Alliance for Peace Building. During a distinguished 27-year Foreign Service career, she served in missions across the globe, including senior assignments in Paris, New Delhi, and in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Serena Hoy is the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Previously, she served in the Office of Legal Affairs at INTERPOL headquarters as a senior counselor to then Deputy Secretary Mayorkas and Secretary Johnson at DHS, and as chief counsel to U.S. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. Before serving in government, she worked at several immigrant rights organizations and clerked for Judge Merrick Garland on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Thank you both for being here with us today. And without objection, your full written testimony will be entered into the record, and we ask you to keep your remarks to about 5 minutes. Undersecretary Zaya.
Chairman Merkley, Co-Chair McGovern, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As Secretary Blinken recently declared, the scale and scope of the challenge posed by the People's Republic of China will test American diplomacy like nothing we've seen before. Few things are more emblematic of this challenge than PRC transnational repression. The reach and frequency of the PRC's global repression is growing more alarming by the day. NGOs have documented thousands of cases over the last several years of the PRC conducting involuntary returns from over 120 countries worldwide. In response to this growing threat, the Biden-Harris administration has developed an approach that is whole of government, inclusive, agile, and results-oriented. With these principles guiding our approach, the administration's strategy to counter PRC transnational repression revolves around 4 key pillars. First, we are using all available tools in coordination with the interagency partners to promote accountability for the PRC's transnational repression. These tools include visa and investment restrictions, export controls, and law enforcement actions in the United States to investigate and prosecute perpetrators. The Secretary's March 2022 announcement of visa restrictions against PRC officials involved in transnational repression is one recent example of accountability actions taken by this administration. Second, we are curbing the PRC's ability to perpetrate these abuses by engaging third countries that may be implicated, willingly or not, in the PRC's transnational repression, as well as international law enforcement agencies and the private sector. We're facilitating more rapid diplomacy with host governments to protect individuals at risk of refoulement. We continue to support INTERPOL reforms to prevent countries from misusing Interpol systems for political or other improper purposes. Our federal assistance programs are empowering civil society activists to mitigate the PRC's transnational repression by providing digital security tools and financial assistance. We're engaging the private sector to ensure that firms are cognizant of and have the tools to counter the PRC's increasingly sophisticated digital authoritarianism. Third, we're building the resilience of targeted communities in the United States and around the world to better understand their needs and develop tailored responses. We're proactively engaging affected communities and developing solutions in partnership. Additionally, we're amplifying the voices of affected communities by shining a light on transnational repression and bringing it out of the shadows. We now report on transnational repression in the department's annual country reports on human rights practices and the annual Trafficking in Persons report. We're advocating for individual cases of transnational repression where family members of activists and others have been imprisoned or disappeared in the PRC. Fourth, we're engaging allies and partners to mount coordinated multilateral responses. We work with partners to jointly advocate for political prisoner cases, many of which have ties to transnational repression. This included a Voices of Political Prisoners event at the December Summit for Democracy, led by Secretary Blinken and Lithuanian Foreign Minister Landsbergis. Additionally, we worked with multiple partners to launch the Export Controls and Human Rights Initiative, which seeks to stem the tide of PRC and other authoritarian governments' misuse of technology. Through the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, we're working with our European partners on developing common standards that will address the misuse of technology that facilitates transnational repression. Lastly, we've sought to call out transnational repression in statements or resolutions at the UN General Assembly and other UN bodies. Just yesterday, 47 countries from the Asia Pacific to Africa to Latin America to Europe signed a joint statement at the Human Rights Council condemning the PRC's human rights abuses and calling on countries to respect the principle of non-refoulement. And we intend to do more. In closing, let me repeat, the PRC's transnational repression poses a direct threat to human rights and democracy, the rules-based international order, and even our own citizens and institutions. And we are combating it with the attention, seriousness, and resources it deserves. Our close partnership with Congress will be integral to this effort. Bipartisan legislation has given us the tools we need to confront the PRC's egregious atrocities and human rights abuses. We welcome an ongoing partnership with Congress to refine our tools and our diplomatic approaches to address the PRC's transnational repression threat. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Zia, and now we'll hear from Assistant Secretary Hoy. Welcome.
Thank you. Chair Merkley, Co-Chair McGovern, and distinguished members of the Commission, it is a privilege to appear before you today to discuss the critical work the Department of Homeland Security is doing to combat the ongoing campaign of transnational repression waged by the People's Republic of China. This practice represents a serious threat to human freedom and security and is an issue of significant human rights and national security concern to DHS. The PRC government uses a range of tactics to control its diaspora, citizens, and others critical of its policies and actions abroad, including sustained efforts to repress multiple members of ethnic and religious minority groups, political dissidents, human rights activists, journalists, and former insiders accused of corruption. My testimony today will focus on the department's efforts to counter attempts by the PRC to intimidate and repatriate perceived opponents present in the United States and to prevent its abuse of the International Criminal Police Organization, known as INTERPOL. I will also discuss how the department has engaged Uyghur and other diaspora communities within the United States to amplify and inform our efforts to counter the PRC's transnational repression activities on U.S. soil, as well as ensure these populations are aware of the tools and best practices available to combat these attacks. DHS has focused with its interagency partners on the PRC's Operation Fox Hunt, through which Beijing targets and seeks to repatriate individuals living in foreign countries whom the PRC alleges are guilty of corruption and should be returned to face criminal charges. The individuals targeted include members of a number of religious and ethnic minority groups, as well as political dissidents. In support of FBI and other government law enforcement and intelligence community efforts to combat Operation Fox Hunt, DHS seeks to provide traditional and non-traditional disruption options to overall investigative strategies pursuant to its broad scope of criminal and administrative, immigration, and customs-related authorities and capabilities. The department also works diligently with our international partners to prevent abuse of law enforcement authorities for political purposes. One of these lines of effort has been our work with our interagency partners over the last year to support the reforms Interpol has undertaken to make it harder for states to target dissidents or other vulnerable populations through the abuse of its systems. In general, we have sought to strengthen the ways in which the U.S. government is able to provide Interpol with relevant information, which can be kept confidential, that would assist it in identifying notices and diffusions that might be based on political motivations. I am particularly invested in these efforts given my previous tenure at Interpol. The department also conducts due diligence to prevent PRC authorities from exploiting DHS information sharing mechanisms, immigration systems, and other tools to engage in transnational repression. Among these efforts, DHS is working to ensure that our law enforcement officers are trained in how to recognize and respond to potentially abusive requests for law enforcement cooperation and are aware of countries known to engage in transnational repression. While DHS seeks to prevent PRC government actors from engaging in transnational repression on U.S. soil, we also engage with the victims of this campaign, including the Uyghur diaspora and other targeted communities. For example, leadership from DHS and the State Department, including Undersecretary Zia, convened a roundtable discussion in March with individuals who have been the targets of transnational repression. That same month, DHS's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties hosted a virtual interagency engagement with the Uyghur diaspora community in the United States to share information on federal resources to address threats of transnational repression. DHS remains unwavering in its efforts to combat transnational repression committed by the PRC and looks forward to working with Congress on ways to address such activities. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today and look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you both for your testimony and, more importantly, for the work you're doing on transnational repression. We'll turn to questions now. And I want to start with something both of you referred to, which is working with targeted communities. And I'm thinking about the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Hong Kongers in the U.S. who are very fearful of their family members being retaliated against inside China if they exercise their free speech and express their concerns about human rights violations or other actions of China they disapprove of. And you mentioned, Assistant Secretary Hui, a conference or a gathering you had held with, I believe it was Uyghur dissidents who were targeted. Could either of you expand on the effort to coordinate with leaders of various dissident communities in the United States so that there's a broad message of kind of how do they, if threatened or they experience actions, they hear about their niece, their nephew, their wife, their son, their grandchild being retaliated against in China, how do they channel that information? Is there kind of a State Department or Department of Homeland Security a hotline or a coordinated effort between the two departments to enable us to collect information about all of the folks that China is targeting?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for raising a very important question. And as Assistant Secretary Hui noted, engagement with diaspora communities is a joint endeavor and one in which the State Department is very committed to. Of course, these targets include Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians, other minorities, and simply, you know, any diaspora PRC citizens seeking to exercise their universal human rights. The responsibility for the U.S. enforcement side, the lead agency on this is the Department of Justice, but we have, as I noted in my opening remarks and my written statements submitted, really prioritized a whole-of-government approach where we had a important roundtable that I and Undersecretary Silvers convened with affected communities, not limited to those targeted by PRC, transnational repression, but certainly included that in March, and follow-on sessions between DHS and diaspora communities, which I'll allow Assistant Secretary Hui to comment on. I would also note that Secretary Blinken has engaged Uyghur exiles in the United States and human rights activists as part of his ongoing effort to center human rights and democratic values in our foreign policy. Assistant Secretary Hui.
Thank you, Undersecretary Zia. Thank you, Senator, for that question. In addition to the roundtable that Undersecretary Zia mentioned and participated in, our Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, this is the roundtable, the virtual interagency engagement I mentioned in my testimony. This was a Uyghur-focused event that CRCL convened, and that was an opportunity for interagency partners to talk to the community about the resources that are available and to listen to their concerns. If there are individuals who have concerns about activity they're experiencing, then as Undersecretary Zia mentioned, our colleagues at the Department of Justice and the FBI would be the right place, where state and local law enforcement authorities who would then work with the FBI on those, on any concerns or complaints would be the lead agency on that. But DHS's ICE, Homeland Security Investigations Agency, works very closely with our FBI partners, and in coordination with them might participate in any investigation if an investigation were appropriate. But as I think you mentioned, it is helpful, even if an investigation isn't appropriate, it is helpful for the FBI and the interagency to monitor trends which enable it to prepare proper responses to respond at a more systemic level to the threat we're facing.
Thank you both, because I'm very intrigued by this question, because I don't believe that our diaspora communities in my home state have any idea of how to report. They will share among themselves their concerns about what they have heard about their family members being targeted. And I have a feeling we're missing, perhaps, possibly missing, a full comprehensive understanding of the extent of the Chinese transnational repression. And so I look forward to following up on this, because I want to publicize with my diaspora communities how to report and channel. I picture that maybe there is a need for a absolute clarity of a coordinated point person for people to be able to share their information with, whether that is at the Department of Justice or so forth. I think many in the diaspora community, when they hear about the pressure back home, aren't thinking of it as a crime to be contacted local police about or the FBI about. I now want to turn to a broader question. I'm picturing a theoretical conversation between perhaps our Secretary of State or our Secretary of Homeland Security and a counterpart in China saying, here is our evidence of what you've done to retaliate against free speech in the United States of America, exercised by members of our Chinese diaspora community. And here's what's going to happen if these cases continue. And I'm trying to picture exactly what the most kind of effective tool is we have to counter. Several tools have been mentioned, and one of those is to hold the perpetrators accountable through visa restrictions and investment restrictions. But can't China really kind of strive to, if you will, make it very hard to identify a specific perpetrator and thereby render such tools less effective?
Mr. Chairman, I do want to respond first to your earlier point. There is about information sharing and reporting this crime. There is a public FPI webpage on transnational repression that has, it's available to all, and clearly we'll want to continue to put the word out about this, but it advises anyone who believes they may have been the victim of this crime how to report it, and it has contact information directly to contact the FBI and, of course, local law enforcement, as you noted. To your point on the tools, absolutely. The administration is deploying a wide range of diplomatic, regulatory, law enforcement tools to deter and ultimately seek accountability for acts of transnational repression. But we're also, as I noted earlier, working to build international opposition to this practice and intensively engaging with allies and partners to hold perpetrators accountable, as this is truly a global phenomenon, not limited to our own shores. We're also working to increase measures that will protect our own citizens from transnational repression through the ongoing engagement with communities that we've noted, but also to actively engage human rights activists, dissidents, journalists, and others who may be very well targeted for their courageous actions.
Thank you. Congressman McGovern.
Thank you. Secretary Zia, you mentioned in your testimony the Chinese government's efforts to pressure other governments to forcibly return people who are seeking asylum in other countries. They are not the only country that does this. Refoulement is a violation of international law, but my question is whether there are sufficient tools in the U.S. toolbox to deter refoulement or punish those who do commit the violation. So the question is there anything besides diplomacy? Is refoulement a sanctionable crime under U.S. authorities? And if not, should it be?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for raising a very important issue. And I would say that on the issue of refoulement, this is a global policy priority for the administration that we raise at the highest levels. I have done so myself in my own international engagement in these 11 months in the job. With respect to refoulement and sanctions, although it's generally not a basis for financial or visa restrictions under our existing authorities, we are absolutely resolute and adamant in calling upon states to respect the principle of non-refoulement and to uphold their obligations in this area as appropriate. And I would say we will continue to explore the extent to which sanctions could apply in these cases with existing authorities.
Well, thank you. I think one of the things that this commission always tries to find are whether or not there are additional tools or authorities that we can act upon here to give to you so that we can, more effectively deter things like refoulement. Obviously, we stand willing to work with you. Assistant Secretary Hoy, while the overall scale of transnational repression is global, individual cases are sometimes very personal, targeting individuals, their families, or their communities. You testified to how DHS components raise awareness amongst U.S. law enforcement agencies who might unwittingly assist Operation Fox Hunt. Does such activity include state and municipal police as well? Does this include coordination and or training?
Thank you, Chair McGovern, Co-Chair McGovern. The HSI is the agency that we have worked with to ensure that HSI and their sister agency within Immigration and Customs Enforcement is trained in recognizing transnational repression and ensures that it doesn't unwittingly aid it. We also have an Office of State and Local Law Engagement that liaises closely with our state and local law enforcement partners. I don't believe that we conduct any training with our state and local law enforcement partners. It may be that the FBI does, but we can look into that and get back to you with that question.
Thank you, because I think that might be, that may be an area where the Chinese government potentially is exploiting, as well as other countries for that matter. Undersecretary Zia, are officers who serve at U.S. embassies and consulates, are they trained to identify potential transnational repression, including transnational repression carried out by Chinese authorities? Do they know what to look for? Are they reporting on that stuff?
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Our raising awareness efforts, of course, include our own teams overseas at our 270-plus U.S. missions, so that has been part of our guidance and training resources and materials to posts in the field so they can learn what this is, how pervasive it is, how to identify it and report it, and most importantly, how to counter it.
Yeah, it seems to me, and maybe because I'm on this commission, I'm becoming more aware of some of these things. But it seems to me that this interference is becoming more of a problem and not less. It's been seems to hear more about it as with each passing year, and I'm wondering whether or not there are, again, that's why I asked the question about are there additional tools that we can provide you that might help, more effectively deter this. I appreciate the diplomacy and in calling out examples of outside interference, attacks on individuals in this country who are exercising their freedom of speech. But it seems that in and of itself is not deterring what seems to be a growing problem. And again, to either of you, are there additional tools that you think that we should look at, that we can provide you? Are there things that Congress can do that might be helpful in kind of not only calling attention to this problem, but deterring it?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I think, for raising a very important question. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks and written statement, yes, this is an upward trend line. We believe this problem is growing, and it's also evolving in terms of the tactics. So we have an imperative to stay ahead of it. We can't have a static response. We have to remain agile and continually refine our tools and our best practices. So in terms of what we were doing, I would say the president's budget request includes funding for the State Department to support a variety of programs that would address and counter transnational repression. But at the same time, there is limited funding currently for state programs to support and help protect victims and individuals who are vulnerable to transnational repression, as well as the capabilities to mitigate surveillance technology and cyber threats. Year after year, we're finding with this trend line that we've declared from the outside, we are consistently receiving more program proposals, more competitive ones than we're able to fund.
Thank you. You back.
Thank you. Next, we would be turning to Senator Ossoff. However, he had to get off to attend another meeting. So, Congressman Smith, you're up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Sure. Thank you to our two distinguished witnesses for their leadership and for being here today to give us these important updates. You know, I wonder if you could tell us to whom would a member of the diaspora report to if they thought that they were being victimized by Chinese Communist Party agents? How confidential is all of that? We know, and I know the chairman referenced it, I do it all the time as well. One of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party continues to have a chokehold on dissidents and people once they come here are the people that are left behind. They're family members who then could be retaliated against with impunity. And I'm wondering, you know, if there's a sensitivity to that, because when somebody does report, and to whom do they report? The FBI? What's the best source? Is there any thought being given to a hotline where somebody could report confidentially that they think they're being harassed by the Chinese Communist Party? Because like I said, I've been in so many events, including the one out in California, where you could pick out, and people were there who could pick out who the agents were. It was very, very eye-opening that in such a brazen way they were there. And of course, a month later, they burnt down the sculpture. So if you could speak to that. And secondly, and again, under Secretary Zaya and Assistant Secretary Hoy, back in February of 2006, I chaired probably the longest hearing I have ever chaired, an 8-hour hearing. We had Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Cisco testify. I swore them in because they were aiding and abetting the Chinese Communist Party in a huge way on surveillance, on censorship. People were being arrested because personally identifiable information, for example, that Yahoo had, was just turned over to the secret police when they made a request for it. And once that happened, all the other contacts were laid bare. You know, had several hearings after that. We raised it over and over again. And I don't think Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and Cisco have joined the democracy side on this. They always, like many U.S. corporations, desperately want to have access to markets. And so they mute their words and their actions. And the most disappointing part of that hearing in February 2006 from the top people from those 4 companies was when they basically said, we're just following orders. If we get a, quote, lawful request for information, we give it. And I said, these aren't police officers. These are secret police officers. These are people who work for a dictatorship, not for a democracy where there's checks and balances, but they nevertheless said, we just turn over the information. So I'm wondering if that has been cured in whole or in part, because I am deeply concerned with so many people who go on social media here. Is it being monitored? And then people back home especially are retaliated against? What are these large high-tech corporations, again, who did nothing but aid and abet the Chinese Communist Party for decades? Where are they now when it comes to these things? And finally, I would just bring up one case that has always troubled me. A guy named Shi Tao, and you might remember him. Yahoo gave up his personally identifiable information when, what did he do? He had sent information to some folks in New York City about what they can and cannot do vis-a-vis the Tiananmen Square commemorations. And for that, he got 10 years in prison. I mean, 10 years for sharing a censorship just like we're seeing in Hong Kong, as all my fellow commissioners know, this year, the churches and others were barred and some even self-censored in not remembering the horrific events of the Tiananmen Square massacre out of fear of retaliation by the Chinese Communist Party. So, these companies, I think, have a lot to account for. Matter of fact, in my opening statement, I pointed out I had read a book years ago called IBM and the Holocaust. And in that book, which was very heavily documented, it talked about how the Gestapo had done such an effective job in finding the Jews throughout Germany and elsewhere because, in large part, IBM was their partner and was using the best high-tech capability available at that time to track down who they were. Matter of fact, in the book, it mentions why did the Gestapo always have these lists? Where did they come from? IBM. And IBM protested when I mentioned this. I said, "Have you read the book?" That kind of complicity with the horrors of the Nazis needs to be apologized for, not defended or cast with dispersions. So the high tech companies, and who do they report to? Hotline. And if you could speak to some of those issues, deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative Smith. You've raised some very important points that I will seek to address from the State Department perspective and then cede the floor to my colleague. With respect to domestic law enforcement, as you're well aware, the State Department defers to U.S. Law enforcement agencies regarding PRC unauthorized activities in the United States. But let me make clear, we continue to oppose the PRC's use of illegal extraterritorial law enforcement activities to target various groups outside its borders and inside our own. This activity is unacceptable, damaging to our bilateral relationship, and must stop. So as an agency, we are working closely with DHS, DOJ, and the FBI to identify and define threats, to help develop and hone policy tools to respond and deter internally. We are sharing information with domestic law enforcement regarding the PRC's overarching transnational repression tactics and trends. And, I can't share details here in an open hearing, but our department does work with DOJ and the FBI to support the investigation and charging of those who are committing this crime inside the United States. To your very important point with respect to misuse of technology, this is a top priority for our State Department, and it is a focal point of our Summit for Democracy effort, where we are working with 100+ governments around the world to lead efforts to develop, as I noted, voluntary codes of conduct to basically shape the norms to apply human rights criteria to export controls. This also corresponds with an effort we're leading to develop common principles, the rules of the road on responsible use of surveillance tech. This requires, ongoing, continual outreach with tech and social media companies to work more actively to counter PRC online harassment, digital surveillance, and disinformation. And we have to make sure that these platforms are not misused to fuel authoritarianism, but in fact, they allow users to freely express themselves without fear of reprisal. I'd like to give my DHS colleague the chance to respond as well.
Thank you very much. I will just say briefly, as discussed with the chair, the FBI has a very helpful website focused on transnational repression, and it may be that we need to ensure that you all have it in a way that's easy for you to communicate with your constituents, but I do believe there is a hotline for reporting these sorts of abuses. And just one note on the surveillance issues raised. Our cybersecurity agency has online resources available. They're free for individuals, for organizations, to share with them best practices for protecting themselves against harassment and stalking and surveillance. Thank you.
If I could just add one final question.
Senator Smith, please keep it brief because we do have several other people waiting.
Okay, hopefully at the highest levels, including the president, when he talks to Xi Jinping, he's raising these issues about, don't harass the diaspora, in addition to all the other human rights abuses that Chinese Communist Party commits. But I hope he's raising it, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And now we'll turn to Senator Ossoff. We think we'll turn to Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Welcome.
And thank you to our panel. Undersecretary Zay, I want to direct my first question to you. Before I took office, I produced investigations of war crimes, organized crime, and official corruption for international news organizations, and press freedom is vital and under threat worldwide, with journalists facing chilling restrictions and threats to their lives and safety increasingly around the world. Reporters Without Borders ranks China 175th out of 180 countries for world press freedom. The CCP's monitoring systems, firewalls, and media controls have shut down any free reporting at home. In November of last year, the BBC reported that the Chinese province of Henan was building a surveillance system with face scanning technology that can detect journalists and other, quote, people of concern. My question for you, Undersecretary, is about the CCP's efforts to repress, intimidate, and chill press freedom beyond the borders of the PRC. How do they engage in such transnational repression? What tactics do they employ to chill and restrict press freedom and free reporting about the CCP, or to influence reporting about the CCP beyond China's borders?
Thank you, Senator, for raising a critically important dimension of our efforts to counter and deter PRC transnational repression. And certainly, we agree that our efforts have to address the concerted PRC effort to, through transnational repression, to shape and suppress media reporting that is shedding a light on what's happening. As the co-chairs noted in their opening remarks, the egregious actions taken against family members of Radio Free Asia journalists is just one emblematic example of the scope and severity of these efforts. In response, our efforts are putting a premium on promoting and protecting open and resilient information ecosystems by addressing the needs of at-risk journalists, fostering the long-term sustainability of independent media outlets, and enhancing the impact of investigative journalism, which is critical to shine a light not only on what is happening inside China, but with respect to this growing threat of transnational repression, which we are discussing today. This is also an area for our multilateral engagement with allies and partners. We have important platforms such as the Media Freedom Coalition and the Freedom Online Coalition, which are building, I would say, like-minded solidarity to address and respond to this problem more collectively and recognize that it is truly global in scope, and we can't be complacent in admiring the problem without taking more concerted action to support free and independent media and investigative journalism.
Thank you, Undersecretary, and I ask for your commitment to work with my office and to set up a meeting between your staff and mine to discuss how we can work together to protect and enhance press freedom and the security of journalists around the world. Will you make that commitment?
Yes, Senator. I'm happy to make that commitment, and we will follow up forthwith.
Thank you. Looking forward to it. Assistant Secretary Ho, I want to ask you about synthetic opioids, the precursors to which are increasingly originating within China. This is a matter of serious concern to my constituents in Georgia. It's why I worked with Senator Grassley to introduce and pass through the Senate our bipartisan Rural Opioid Abuse Prevention Act. According to the Georgia Department of Public Health, drug overdose deaths in Georgia increased by 55% from 2019 to 2021. And according to the DEA, China is one of the primary sources for fentanyl-related substances, and the precursors to synthetic opioids. I want to ask you this question, and it's one particular to my state. I'm asking for your commitment to work through my office to connect and consult directly with local law enforcement agencies in Georgia, as well as the Georgia Ports Authority and the leadership at the Port of Savannah, to ensure that we are mitigating the flow of illicit opioids produced and originating in China, or produced and originating elsewhere with ingredients and precursors originating in China into the state of Georgia and the United States. Will you please make that commitment to work with me with that focus on Georgia as part of your national portfolio, and to have your staff follow up with mine to set up those actions?
Senator, thank you for that question. It's an issue of the utmost importance for the Department of Homeland Security and the interagency partners that we work with, as well as our international partners, and we would be happy to follow up with your office and your staff on that.
I appreciate the commitment of follow-up. I just want to be clear and precise. What I'm looking for is a commitment to work with my office to connect the department directly with local law enforcement and the Georgia Ports Authority to enhance our collaboration to protect Georgians from these dangerous substances. Will you please make that commitment explicitly?
Yes, Senator, you have our commitment.
Thank you kindly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Ossoff, and we'll now turn to Congresswoman Steele.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A recent report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute found the Asian women are the newest targets of the CCP. Women who spoke against the CCP have been victim to repeated cases of digital harassment that result in unspeakable attacks, rape threats, and distribution of fabricated photos. We must continue to denounce the CCP harassment and disinformation campaigns. Stopping transnational repression must be a joint effort. Our country should also work with other countries to fight this abusive tactic and let the whole world knows. Under Secretary Zaya, does the State Department have a directive to work with other countries to condemn digital transnational repression? If not, is something preventing this partnership from moving forward?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for raising a very important point with respect to digital repression and how to counter it. And I will be clear, we absolutely recognize the severity of PRC's efforts to use digital means to spread disinformation, but also to intimidate, coerce, and censor critics globally. So our response to this effort is absolutely resolute and multi-pronged, and it is absolutely grounded in increased collaboration with allies and partners. One, we are working to expose these tactics by working with partner governments, as well as the private sector and tech platforms, to identify inauthentic and ultimately bullying behavior. Second, we are working to puncture narratives, including by providing factual information through third-party researchers and calling out these attacks as they occur. Third, we're working with allies and partners to build resilience to these threats, particularly among those targeted, and you described, I think, quite well, the vulnerability of the courageous women and others who are speaking up about China's human rights situation, and we are working to share information and support their capacity to protect themselves online. And fourth, as I mentioned in my comments to Senator Ossoff, we are absolutely determined to promote and protect open and resilient information ecosystems so that at-risk journalists and others can continue their vital work free from reprisal and threats.
Thank you for your answer. And Are State Department officials equipped to identify transnational repression attacks from the CCP? And do officials communicate within other agencies or officials in other countries to help fight future attacks?
Thank you for raising this question. I mean, we are continually gathering information from public as well as private, non-public sources to consider all the facts at our disposal, as I noted earlier, in what is a evolving tactics of transnational repression. These inform our efforts in coordination with allies and partners, with multilateral actors, with civil society and the private sector. So I would say we are in a continual mode of reviewing all credible information with respect to PRC transnational repression, as well as PRC officials' specific responsibility for these actions.
So is that any way possible that Congress members can get into those informations and data that you collected?
Well, Madam Congresswoman, I would certainly recommend that we could follow up with a briefing for your staff where we might be able to discuss this information in more specific detail. I'm happy
really
to commit to
appreciate
that.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Steele. And now we'll turn to Congressman Mast.
Yep. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you.
Good. Thank you for your time today, ma'am. So I have just, I guess you'd say a brief statement on this, and then I'd love to know your analysis and your thoughts on this. My understanding is that, there are red notices that are published through Interpol saying, we need an extradition of this individual, or we need this person to be detained or arrested for this reason because of these, the accusations of these crimes. And we know this is something that we use. China uses that as well as other countries. My understanding is that China is using this for the purposes of political suppression, getting people extradited back to China, again, for the purpose of political suppression, and not necessarily because they've broken crimes that would be considered, that would be considered anything other than free speech. So in that, what is your understanding of that occurring? And then to go beyond that, has there been success with the administration in combating what China is doing with these red notices? Are there other government agencies that China is using in a similar way for political repression to bring people back in to be detained in China in other ways that we might be missing? And that would be the breadth of my question.
Thank you, Representative Mast, for raising a very important point. And I will be clear, we absolutely share your concern for the potential misuse of Interpol systems to target dissidents, human rights defenders, activists, journalists, and others via PRC transnational repression. Now, while the Department of Justice is the lead U.S. agency on Interpol, the State Department is working in has worked in close collaboration with DOJ, and some, specific successes we've had were on the successful election campaigns for two U.S. representatives to two key Interpol bodies, including the Executive Committee, and this is part of our, determined effort to prevent the misuse of Interpol's tools. We're also working to identify and provide more tools to support Interpol's Notices and Diffusion Task Force to protect the integrity of red notice requests and wanted persons diffusions. I'd like to defer to Assistant Secretary Hoy, who I think has more to offer here.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm pleased you raised this issue. This is something I care about a lot as a former staff member at Interpol. Interpol, after conducting a comprehensive analysis of its tools and the way that they might be abused, undertook a series of reforms over a number of years, but in 2016 stood up the task force that Undersecretary Zaya referenced, on which I used to work, that works very hard to ensure that requests from member countries are vetted for exactly the concerns that you raised. if those issues are identified, obviously the notices aren't published. However, Interpol only knows what it knows. It only knows information that's available on through public sources or information that's shared with it by its member countries. So the administration, as has been mentioned in this hearing, has been focused on this issue of transnational repression and has launched an internal effort, an interagency effort to ensure that the U.S. government is doing everything it can to support the reforms that Interpol itself launched. So that includes ensuring that the U.S. government is sharing with Interpol the information that it might have that indicates that a request, a red notice, or other request might not be for legitimate law enforcement purposes, but actually to persecute dissidents. And if the U.S. government receives a request, an Interpol notice or another request for law enforcement cooperation, law enforcement agencies, including the Department of Justice or the Department of Homeland Security, conduct due diligence to look into whether or not the request is for a legitimate law enforcement purpose. And if it's identified that it's not, that's information that we have sought to and are working harder to strengthen our efforts to share that information with Interpol where relevant so that Interpol can take appropriate action with respect to the request. Thank you.
Thank you, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. We have two members who may be joining us but may not be here yet, so I'll just ask, has Senator Daines or Congressman Malinowski joined us yet electronically? They are not here yet, but I gather they will be. And meanwhile, I'm going to try to explore a little bit more this process by which Americans or migrants living in the United States who are experiencing their family members back in China being harassed, perhaps detained, perhaps disappeared, perhaps threatened, how they report that. And you all clarified that there is an FBI website addressing this, so that is the primary point of contact. So let's imagine a situation in which a citizen back in Oregon shares with my office that their family is being harassed because of their statements about Chinese human rights violations. And so I direct them to this FBI website. The FBI looks at it and says, well, this isn't a crime within the United States because it's something happening back in China. It's not FBI that has the ability to, if you will, engage in the intelligence operation to know who is ordering that harassment or if that action is related to the action of the individual in the United States. Meanwhile, that FBI report doesn't necessarily get to the Department of State or the Department of Homeland Security. So I want to clarify, at what point does a report being made at the FBI website, is it immediately shared with the Department of State, so the Department of State can start to think about who is responsible? Is there coordination with the intelligence community to help determine who's making that order? Because if our main kind of tool is to say, hey, China, if your folks are involved in this, they're going to be sanctioned. They're not going to be able to have they're going to have a travel restriction or an investment restriction or a visa restriction. But I'm not seeing that there is really a clear path to make that an effective tool. So I guess I'll boil down my question to you, Undersecretary Zia. Do you immediately get notified? And do we feel that there's really an effective pathway in which you're able to have this kind of tracked down and effectively respond in a way that makes China think twice about having engaged in such retaliation against family members back home in China?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for probing in more detail on, let's say, the operational mechanisms of our coordination. I'm not able to share the details in this public hearing, based on a hypothetical what point it would occur, but I would propose that if we could follow up with a briefing, a closed briefing for you and other commission members, we could describe more in detail how this works. I will say, though, I'm hearing loud and clear, your concern and that of other commission members that this information needs to be more broadly disseminated, and what to do when, in fact, a crime may be committed well outside the United States with family members in the U.S. basically, being intimidated or threatened with reprisals for family members not within our country. I would highlight here that we have our Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department, which I oversee, and they do receive referrals from member offices, and they are, very keen to continue that direct engagement, and they can take this information, act on it appropriately, and it can really help us in our own data and information sharing efforts to ascertain what's happening and take appropriate accountability action. So I don't want you to feel that the only route is to, go the route of the FBI information, for the public, or that it's only to go to local law enforcement. I think if, we are receptive and open to receiving queries from you and your fellow members if you feel that there is a case that is not being acted upon or taken seriously.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary, and for your offer of a confidential or potentially classified briefing open to members of the commission. We'll take you up on that offer, and we'll further pursue kind of the appropriate way we can educate members about how to translate information, communicate information to your team when our constituents contact us. I want to ask one other question here, which is we have heard from certain human rights organizations that it is common for China to have a specific member of their diplomatic community at each embassy responsible for coordinating harassment of the Chinese diaspora that is critical of China. Can you comment on that?
We would take such information very seriously and integrate it into our own efforts to determine what is happening and how we can hold individuals accountable. But I do not have further information to share in this public setting.
Okay, great. Well, we'll pursue that further. I was struck by Congressman Smith's testimony about kind of the brazenness of the presence of individuals in his home district who are monitoring the behavior of Chinese diaspora. And that's all just goes towards this huge assault on freedom of expression here in the United States. And I know you're all very much concerned about that. That's why we're holding this hearing, really emphasizing that. I certainly appreciate it. And I think we're going to have a lot more work to do to try to curb or end these strategies, not just by China, but by other governments. Let me turn to the co-chair, Congressman McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question, and I have to go to another hearing, but Undersecretary Zia, in February, Chair Merkley and I sent a letter to Secretary Blinken about reports that Uyghurs in Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Kazakhstan might be at risk of refoulement to China, where obviously they could face torture and imprisonment and other kinds of abuse. In April, Amnesty International reported on an imminent refoulement of a mother and daughter from Saudi Arabia to China. I don't know whether you can tell us what the State Department has done on these cases, and I guess I have a request that that you urge the White House to ensure that the Uyghur cases are on President Biden's agenda if, in fact, he does go to Saudi Arabia next month.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for citing your letter, which I read carefully, and certainly your concern on refoulement is a shared one by this administration. And as I noted in my opening remarks, this was an element of the Human Rights Council statement that the Netherlands led in terms of reaffirming the importance of countries respecting their obligations on non-refoulement. With respect to Saudi Arabia and Morocco, I can assure you that the United States is closely tracking and engaging at high levels with the governments in question on this issue. This applies to Kazakhstan as well, and I can tell you that I raised this issue personally on my trip, my visit to Kazakhstan just a couple of months ago. So this is an ongoing and high-level concern for our engagement.
And I guess I would just close by, again, reiterating my hope that as much as I hope the president does not go to Saudi Arabia, if he does, that he raised this issue with the government there, because again, human rights organizations have pointed to the fact that Saudi Arabia may very well be engaged in these activities, and as I pointed out, I gave an example of a specific case. So again, I hope that there'll be a recommendation that if he does go, that he will raise this issue specifically.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We will certainly convey your concern and request.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And I might add in that vein that Saudi Arabia has worked to sweep several individuals out of the state of Oregon, and we found this is a practice around the United States of those who have been involved in significant crimes against American citizens, including murder, rape, and other egregious activities. And Senator Wyden and I have made a big issue out of this, and we really want to convey that it's so important that this get raised along with other human rights issues if the president proceeds to go to Saudi Arabia. Let me now turn to Senator Daines.
Senator Merkley, thank you. And I want to thank you all for coming before this commission today. I've spent more than half a decade actually professionally working in China as an expat in the private sector. I've led several congressional delegation visits to China as well as its neighbors. As I look at what's going on at the moment, it's clear the United States needs to work closely with our allies to counter China's growing economic coercion and influence, as well as its efforts to export its surveillance state abroad, including initiatives to silence criticism abroad and intimidate or harass the Uyghurs, Tibetans, or dissidents who no longer reside in the PRC. Undersecretary Zaya, it's readily apparent that China is not satisfied with simply censoring its own population, but aggressively seeks to influence speech and actions abroad, including the self-censorship of dissidents, foreign publishers, businesses, or academic journals related to China. What are the long-term effects of such actions, and what is being done to help both partners and allies in the region, as well as the private sector and private sector stakeholders to withstand such pressures?
Thank you, Senator. You raised a very important point with respect to self-censorship. We absolutely reject this, and we find it unacceptable that PRC surveillance, harassment, and intimidation is prompting its own citizens and others abroad to self-censor their words and actions out of a fear of reprisal or retaliation. So respect for freedom of expression, as you know, is a bedrock American principle. This is integrated into our transnational repression response as we call on the PRC to respect the right of those inside and outside their borders to express their own opinions. As you noted, working with allies and partners is absolutely essential. So we are working with foreign governments to expose these tactics through our Global Engagement Center, through other multilateral efforts such as the Freedom Online Coalition and the Media Freedom Coalition, which Canada is leading at this moment. We are also working, as I noted, to puncture PRC narratives in this space and providing, factual information that sheds a light, an antiseptic light on the misinformation and propaganda being put forward by the PRC side. We're working very closely with allies and partners to build resilience to these threats and Just earlier this month, our Global Engagement Center signed a new and important memorandum of understanding with the United Kingdom to enhance our already strong counter-disinformation and counter-propaganda activities. And, the final element of this effort is what I noted earlier in the testimony, an imperative to really promote and protect open and resilient information ecosystems as a counterpoint to the Great Firewall and the absolute censorship exercised by the PRC by meeting the critical needs of at-risk journalists, supporting long-term sustainability of independent media, and enhancing the impact of investigative journalists, and bolstering all of these actors' resilience to legal and regulatory challenges, which are often, censorship in disguise. So initiatives such as the Journalist Protection Platform, part of our Summit for Democracy, Presidential Initiative on Democratic Renewal, are very important in terms of an affirmative effort to allow a counterpoint to this nefarious disinformation and self-censorship.
Thank you. I want to follow up with a question that relates to the digital yuan, because I think there's also, you use the words nefarious. As you know, China's in the process of testing a digital yuan. When most countries look into digital currencies, they're very concerned about privacy implications. China's motivation stems in large part from a desire to gain insights into the financial lives of its citizens. Now, Undersecretary, how could a push by the Chinese government to spread the usage of the digital yuan outside of its own borders threaten human rights in neighboring countries and countries where China has made significant capital investments?
Well, Senator, I would concur. There is absolutely a human rights nexus with digital yuan, or what is often called the ECNY. We believe that the PRC's very poor record of responsible behavior in cyberspace and misuse of technology raises very serious concerns about widespread adoption of platforms and standards related to tech developed by the PRC in general, and this includes the ECNY. We have very well-based concerns that ECNY could pose a heightened privacy and consumer protection risk, and could also enhance the PRC's surveillance and social control capabilities, some of their primary tools for transnational repression, and further extend that globally. So we are urging individuals, businesses, and global financial institutions to assess these risks cautiously and to, integrate human rights concerns before considering any use of ECNY. Our counterpoint to that is also an affirmative agenda of using technology in a way that serves our people, protects our interests, and upholds our democratic values. And that is part of our multilateral efforts with allies and partners to ensure responsible development of digital assets that will put guardrails in place that prevent this kind of misuse of technology from proliferating more widely.
In the 30 seconds I have left, and this will be for both of you, how are your agencies seeking to improve monitoring, measurement, and effectiveness of efforts to counter transnational repression? I'm about out of time, so I'll start with the Undersecretary first.
Well, monitoring and evaluation is a critical element of our work through the department as a whole, and I think we are investing in that and ensuring that, we are not simply putting programs in place, but really, as I emphasized at the top, our TNR effort is results-oriented, so we need to see that we are having a measurable impact on the problem we are seeking to address.
You have a comment on that?
Thank you, Senator. And this is actually an opportunity for me to go back to a point that that the chair made earlier about his concern that reports of individuals who may be subject to an act of transnational repression on U.S. soil might report it to the FBI, and then it might stay there and not be shared with the FBI's interagency partners. And I just want to make a point that the FBI has task forces around the country. Homeland Security investigations under the Department of Homeland Security is a participant in those task forces all over the country. So when reports do come into the FBI and those are investigated, that is shared within the interagency law enforcement community. So that's an excellent way for the law enforcement community to be monitoring trends, whether or not it ends up in a criminal investigation. It's a way for the law enforcement community to know what's happening and to ensure that that helps shape our response as a law enforcement community to the activity we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Merkley, thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Daines. Thank you for bringing your direct experience in China to this conversation today. And we are so pleased to have Congressman Malinowski with us. He has direct experience working in the Department of State in these areas, and let me turn it over to you for your opportunity to make comments and ask questions.
Thank you so much, Senator Merkley, for holding this hearing. Undersecretary Zaya, good to see you way over there. And I apologize, I, of course, missed your testimony in most of the exchanges, so I would assume most of the obvious issues have been covered. Obviously, I share the concerns of everybody in this room with respect to China and other countries reaching beyond their borders to harass, intimidate, and harm people who are critics of their governments. I applaud the administration for identifying transnational repression as a particular threat. I have a human rights background. I do not see this as a human rights issue. I see this as part of the United States exercising, our government exercising its most fundamental responsibility, and that is to protect people inside our country. This is a national security issue. And as such, I think it should be centrally elevated over virtually everything else that we do with the governments that are responsible for this kind of conduct. With respect to China, one aspect of the CCP's efforts that I've been concerned about for some time is pressure on American companies and other foreign companies to censor their employees, to change the ways in which they do business, to avoid any real or perceived criticism of the Chinese government. There was, of course, a case a couple of years ago that got a lot of attention involving the Houston Rockets, the NBA team, which did in fact seek to punish one of its American employees for personal speech that was critical of the Chinese government. I think that's an ongoing phenomenon, and I wonder whether you have any thoughts about the proper role of the U.S. government and Congress in developing standards for American companies, multinational companies, when it comes to how they should respond to that kind of pressure.
Thank you, Representative Malinowski, for raising, I think, a very important issue that was also raised by Senator Daines about self-censorship. And certainly, we reject PRC surveillance, harassment, intimidation that is prompting its own citizens and others, as you noted, abroad to self-censor their words and actions. We enshrine freedom of expression as a bedrock American principle centered in our foreign policy. So we are resolute in supporting exercise of that right, and we absolutely call on the PRC to respect that right of those inside and outside its borders to express their own opinions. I think our engagement with the private sector is ongoing, with respect to business advisories for Hong Kong and Xinjiang that have made clear that we need to engage American companies directly to ensure that they do not facilitate or fall victim to PRC repression or censorship efforts. So I would say this is an ongoing area of engagement as part of our whole of government effort to respond to and curb PRC transnational repression.
Should we prohibit U.S. companies from complying with censorship requests?
In terms of prohibition, I think I'm not in a position to pronounce on that point, but we certainly regularly engage U.S. companies and point out where I think quite clearly they don't want to be part of the PRC's repressive efforts inside and certainly outside China within U.S. borders.
Well, it's an unfair question because it would be really up to the U.S. Congress, but I do think it is within the administration's purview, as you've done in other similar realms, to be thinking about the development of voluntary standards that go beyond just raising concerns in individual cases. I think we've been very defensive about this. Something happens and then we express concern, but I think there's at least room for a more proactive effort to develop preemptive standards that companies could at least sign up to. I'm going to cheat a little bit here. We're talking about transnational repression, and it's hard to do that with regard to China alone. President is embarking on a trip to Saudi Arabia, which was responsible for the most horrific act of transnational repression aimed at somebody within the United States in recent years. I wonder whether you guys can assure us that those operations to target, harass, intimidate, pressure critics of Saudi Arabia within the United States have ceased. And has the State Department conferred with the FBI to assure itself of that, hopefully, fact?
Well, thank you, Representative, for sharing your concerns. I would say for my preparation for this hearing was focused on transnational repression from the PRC, but we certainly take your concerns on board with respect to Saudi Arabia. Our efforts to curb transnational repression are absolutely global, and we will take your position into account. There's really nothing further I could share here in a public hearing.
Okay. I think it would be very helpful to have an assessment from the FBI, because the case we all know about, the Khashoggi case, was the tip of the iceberg. I think we all know that there was routine harassment and intimidation of a number of people in the United States. And then finally, again, a global question. The only law in our books, as far as I know, with respect to transnational repression is the Arms Export Control Act, which prohibits arms sales to any country that engages in a pattern of intimidation and harassment of persons in the United States. Does the State Department have any process by which it evaluates compliance with that standard with regard to countries around the world?
Well, one of the points that I made in terms of our multilateral responses to transnational repression is certainly focused in the area of export controls and human rights. And this is one of the priority action sets from the Summit for Democracy, where we are working with like-minded countries to develop new norms that are going to strengthen collective action and responsibility to ensure these issues are integrated not only by the United States, but by several other leading allies and partners around the world.
Okay, that's not a direct answer to my question, but we will follow up. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Malinowski, and for the expertise you bring on human rights to this conversation. So as we wrap up here, I want to note that in the conversation with Senator Daines, you referred to the ECNY as a term for the digital yuan. Can you tell us what ECNY stands for?
I would have to ask my staff to give that relevant detail.
All right, very
Chairman.
good.
Sorry about
We
that.
were speculating here that it was electronic currency, national yuan, but I had not heard that term before. Thank you. Both of you mentioned that the FBI has a website for transnational repression, so I asked my team to print out information regarding that, and I have here a copy of several pages of the website, and in addition, the information that it has in various languages, many different languages, but including Uyghur and Chinese that are in my hand, and I'll submit those for the record. I was struck in looking at this website that it says how to report. It says contact your local FBI field office, contact the FBI online at tips.fbi.gov. Then it provides a different website on the Uyghur language and Chinese language, which is fbi.gov/tips. But nothing specific about a hotline for transnational repression. And of course, thousands and thousands of things come into the FBI in a generalized tip hotline. So maybe one of the things we can explore is whether there needs to be a more specific way to channel reports of transnational repression. I was also struck in reviewing this that while the FBI website does mention threatening or detaining family members in a home country is a form of transnational repression, all the rest of the information is really about threats to those inside the United States. And so I really want to see how we elevate this threat against people in the home country, because it is such an effective strategy for China in discouraging freedom of speech and freedom of the press, freedom of assembly here in the United States, and it's just so absolutely unacceptable. And it's very hard to pinpoint where those instructions, if you are coming from and being coordinated against home country family members. I just want to conclude by noting, really appreciate Undersecretary Zaya and Assistant Secretary Hoy, the work you're all doing on transnational repression. It is a growing problem, and it's magnified by social media and by new technologies, surveillance and facial recognition and forms of communication. And it is an assault on the freedom of the citizens and residents of the United States of America. That we need to do all we can to develop effective responses to. I am noting that we are anticipating written statements from the Uyghur Human Rights Project and Freedom House that will be entered into the record when they are received without objection, and that the record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, June 17th, for any items members would like to submit for the record or any additional questions for all of you as witnesses. And again, thank you very much for your expertise and your presentation and your work on this important issue. This hearing is adjourned.